Welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV, which is being jointly hosted with the resistance movement, or by the resistance movement, and the Labour Against the Witch Hunt. Both of this evening's guests have been targeted by the concocted anti-Semitism witch hunt. Our first guest is Moshe Machover. I'm very pleased to have Moshe with us. He's one of the founders of Matzon, which was a socialist anti-Zionist organization that was established in Israel in 1962. And I'm sure many people will be well aware that he's also a distinguished mathematician, philosopher, and socialist activist who has written extensively about Zionism and the conflict in the Middle East. And our other guest is Tony Greenstein, who's a prolific blogger and a long-standing socialist activist himself. He's noted for his acerbic wit in his writings, and I remember him comparing John McDonnell to Stafford Cripps in one of his op-eds, in which he said that the only difference was that Stafford Cripps had a backbone. Despite being the son of a rabbi who confronted Oswald Mosley's fascists at the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, Tony's was one of the very first victims of the diabolical witch hunt that resulted in his expulsion from the Labour Party. Now, as I say, this is an event which is jointly hosted between the Resistance TV, the Resistance Movement's YouTube channel, and Labour Against the Witch Hunt. And I'm going to hand over to Tina Werkmann, who is the leading light of the Labour Against the Witch Hunt event. Again, Tina probably needs no introduction, but she's a brilliant activist and yet another individual, I regret to say, who's also been targeted by these egregious smears against hundreds of thousands of Labour Party activists. But I'll hand over to Tina now, and she'll chair the meeting for the rest of this evening's session. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade, and welcome everybody to this meeting. We've had 250 people register, which is fantastic. Not quite as many as registered for our session on defending or calling for the reinstatement of Jeremy Corbyn, which had over 500 people register and has been watched thousands of times now. And I think has been outstanding in terms of the message we're putting out, that we are not keeping quiet. We are not calling for unity with the right, which incredibly some organizations on the left now are doing. And we're also continuing to call out those who want not just unity with the right, but also asking us to keep quiet. We're saying we've published motions, we're publishing CLP statements and resolutions calling for the reinstatement of Jeremy Corbyn. Funnily enough, I was able to use a lot of what we worked on with Chris Williamson when we had to dig up why there is no ban. You know, the ban introduced that Jeremy Formby tried to introduce to stop passing motions in support with you has now been used against Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes.
As it would be. It was pretty inevitable that this happens. Nevertheless, we have to fight it, and we shall fight it. This is all very linked, of course, to tonight's session. So we did set this up way before Jeremy was suspended, because there is an international campaign to delegitimize and, in fact, now criminalize anti-Zionism by equating it with anti-Semitism. It would be wrong to state, and I'm sure neither Moshe nor Tony are going to do this, or anybody in the audience, that this is simply orchestrated by Israel. That would not be successful. This is a campaign supported by pretty much all the Western governments. We're working on a campaign in defense of free speech, and we've gone through all the different governments who've started to label the BDS movement as anti-Semitic. Which has just culminated actually in the US government proposing to label Oxfam and Amnesty International as anti-Semitic, which was, again, it's entirely inevitable. It's where this campaign has been leading for some time. It's an attack not just on pro-Palestinian demonstrators and protesters. It's an attack on the whole left, actually. In Britain, this finds reflections in attempts to cut funding for universities that don't accept the IRA definition or misdefinition of anti-Semitism, and in schools being prevented to discuss anti-capitalism, to teach anti-capitalism as it is. So there's a massive campaign going on to attack the left and to attack Palestine solidarity movement. We have to, in order to fight back properly though, we need to understand what Zionism is and why, you know, we are anti-Zionists. We could argue, and I'm sure we get to that, that if you want to really fight racism, including anti-Semitism, in fact, you need to be an anti-Zionist. So I'm not going to ramble on much longer. I think Moshe is going to speak first.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I want to say that the Labour Party leader made a commitment regarding what I regard not as a witch hunt, it is really a heresy hunt. They don't burn us, they excommunicate us. So it is a heresy hunt, and what is typical of a heresy hunt is that those who deny the heresy of those who are excommunicated are accused of heresy themselves. And this has happened to two of my colleagues in this panel. Sir Keir has made a commitment to, I think, to the Board of Jewish Deputies that he will penalize people who share a platform with those excommunicated and accused by someone of anti-Semitism, of course, fake accusation, that he will also excommunicate those who share a platform with them. I have contempt for this commitment, and I'm happy to publicly break it. I'm proud to share a panel with Chris Williamson. It's the first time I have a sort of direct communication with him. I've long had a communication with Tony Greenstein. We have often disagreed, but the disagreement has been, I think, very fruitful. So now to the point. I would like to make it very, very elementary, very simple. I don't want to overload you with information and quotations. I just want to concentrate on the basics. That is to say, what is Zionism for beginners? But it is essential that you internalize this, that you really get the essence of what Zionism is before you start to have an attitude whether to oppose it or not to oppose it. This is up to your own moral set of values. So to begin with, Zionism is really a movement, and it is a movement with many strands. Of course, there are many factions within it, but they all share some core ideology and a core project. So I would like, first of all, to spell out what is the core ideology of Zionism and what is the core project of Zionism. Ideology has two essential ingredients, two essential articles of belief that are shared by all strands of Zionism. Number one is the totality of all Jews constitute a single nation or a national entity. This has been questioned and challenged by a lot of people, and initially mostly by Jews themselves. For example, as I think Tony mentioned, the Board of Jewish Deputies at the time of the Balfour Declaration rejected this idea vehemently. It is indeed a very questionable article of faith. The various Jewish communities around the world have only religion or their religious background, heritage, if you like, in common. Not all of them practice Judaism, but this is what they all have in common and nothing else. They don't have a common daily language. They don't have a common culture, secular culture. The only thing they have in common is religion. Moreover, in order to become a Jew, a non-Jew has to undergo a religious conversion. Has to go to a rabbi, he or she has to go to a rabbi and undergo conversion. This is both necessary and sufficient to become a Jew. Anybody who is not a Jew can become a Jew by religious conversion. And conversely, a Jew who becomes, let's say, a Muslim is no longer a Jew. Actually, the laws of Israel, the legal system of Israel is unique in actually defining who is a Jew. And cases have appeared before the Israeli court of people who were born Jewish but converted to other religions, and the court ruled that they cannot be considered Jewish. So this doesn't sound to me as a national entity. Usually, I mean, we think of a nation as a secular concept. In the modern sense, so, a secular concept, people of the same nation can be of various religions. People of the same religion can be of various nations. But Judaism is essentially a religion. The second article of faith of Zionist ideology is that this alleged nation has a right, some right to possess the Holy Land, the land of Israel, as they call it, or Palestine, as most other people have come to call it. The arguments produced by for this claim are very dodgy. They say that Jews have a long-standing sentimental connection to the Holy Land. Well, that's true, but if you have a sentimental connection to somebody or something, it doesn't give you the right to possess it, according to normal criteria. Or that very long ago, centuries and centuries ago, there were Jewish kingdoms in that part of the world. Well, yes, so there were Welsh kingdoms in various parts of England. That doesn't give the Welsh people the right to possess those parts of England. And so forth. The only argument that you cannot argue with is that God promised this land to the Jews. Well, you can't argue with God, but in order for this argument to be compelling, you have to believe in God, not only in a God, but in the God of that religion. But apparently, you know, it has been said that in order to be a Zionist, you don't have to believe in God, but you have to believe that God promised the land of Israel to the Jews. Well, this of course, is a paradoxical way of putting it. Okay, so these are the very questionable, essential ideological elements of Zionism. You cannot be a Zionist without believing in these two tenets, and if you oppose them, then you are anti-Zionist in the ideological sense. But let me go now on to the practical aspect of it. It is Zionism is a project, not only an ideology, but a project, and the project follows from the ideology. Basically, Zionism is a project of colonizing Palestine in order to convert it to a majority Jewish state. The term colonization I use not as a kind of vituperation or expletive. It is the way the Zionist movement described itself. To say that it is a colonizing project is not sufficient because there have been colonizations of various types, and it is very important to understand what type of colonization, Zionist colonization, has been and is continues to be. Unlike other types of colonization, it was not aimed at exploiting the labor power of the indigenous people. It, from the beginning, it assumed correctly that in order to get a Jewish majority state in Palestine, it would be wrong to try to make use of the labor power of the indigenous people, because the direct producers in every society are the majority. And this is a clear difference, a clear distinction between, for example, the type of Zionist colonization that Zionism undertook and what took place in South Africa. In South Africa, the South African economy under apartheid depended on the labor power of the indigenous people. They could be set apart. Apartheid was based on separation, but not complete separation. Separation in social and political terms, but not in economic terms. The indigenous people were essential, were necessary for the apartheid regime. The Zionist type of colonization is, in a sense, more apartheid than the original South African apartheid, because from the point of view of Zionism, the indigenous population are surplus to requirement. And Zionist colonization is therefore similar to other places where the colonizers did not make use of the labor power of the indigenous people, but were themselves direct producers. They displaced the indigenous population rather than try to expel them. This is essential to understand the nature of the project of Zionism and the Israeli state, which is both a product and an instrument of this project of colonization. So I would say that this is the basic thing that you have to understand about the Zionist project, that it is a project of colonization, and it is a project of colonization of the basic type that aims not to exploit the indigenous people as far as possible, but to displace them. And the type of racism that this project is accompanied with is typical of that type of colonization. There are various types of racism. Racism is not one thing. There are all, it comes in all varieties and shades. And especially in the case of colonizations and settler states, the type of racism depends on what type of colonization it is. If you look, for example, at the United States, there were two distinct types of racism that have been and lingering in that country. There was a racism directed against the people who were exploited as slaves. Now, in order to justify this exploitation, the black people, the slaves imported from Africa and exploited horribly, were described as inferior people, as somehow primitive human beings, not on the same intellectual and moral level as their owners. On the other hand, the racism towards the indigenous Native Americans who were not exploited as labor was quite different. They were regarded as dangerous, wild, if you like, noble savages. They were not, towards them, the kind of racism that was applied was not of the same kind as towards the exploited slaves. So you have to understand this in order to understand the type of racism that Zionist colonization is accompanying with, because racism is normally an ideology and practice that serves to justify colonization, exploitation, wherever it exists, and other types of oppression. And therefore, I would say also, you know, the fake definition of anti-Semitism, or one of the examples that is given accompanying it, forbids or defines as anti-Semitic any comparison of Zionist practices in the state of Israel, the laws of Israel and the practices, with what was current in Nazi Germany. You're not allowed to make this comparison. Well, I think that this comparison is not anti-Semitic, it is simply not to the point. The true comparison is, I think we should make, is not between the laws and practices of Israel and that of Nazi Germany, but the practices of the Zionist regime of Israel with other colonialist enterprises of a similar nature. So you make the comparison. Is Zionist colonization, is the racist practices as bad as Britain's practices in Tasmania? No, no, they're not as bad. Zionism is less horrible than what the British did in Tasmania. Is it as bad as or as good as what happened in the relatively most benign case, that of New Zealand? No. Zionism is worse than the colonization of New Zealand. I think this is the kind of comparison that you should make. It is rather similar on the same level as the crimes committed by colonizers of North America against the indigenous Native American population. I think this is the kind of comparison that makes sense. Now, although Zionist colonization is of a type that I mentioned, similar to what took place in North America, in Australia, in New Zealand, not so much in South Africa, where there was a different form of colonization. Nevertheless, it has some unique and exceptional features. The most obvious exceptional feature of Zionist colonization is its anachronistic nature. All other similar forms of colonization were over and done with by the middle of the 19th century. The native populations had been marginalized, exterminated, ethnically cleansed, or otherwise similarly dealt with. Zionist colonization is exceptional in that it is still ongoing. It is different from other similar types of colonization, as an active volcano is different from extinct volcanoes. So it is ongoing. It is not something that happened in the past. It is something that is continuing. And if you look at the practices of the state of Israel, you see it in action. The state of Israel, as I said before, is not only a product of Zionist colonization, it is also a political instrument for perpetuating it and continuing it. It is an instrument for the Zionist equivalent of what in North America was the project of manifest destiny, which claimed that the white settlers had a manifest destiny to colonize the whole of the American North continent from sea to shining sea. Another exceptional feature of Zionism is the following. Whereas other similar forms of colonization were sponsored by an empire that sent its own citizens, its own people to colonize the various parts of the world. I mean, as in Australia, as in North America, as in New Zealand, as in Tasmania. In the case of Zionism, the settlers had no mother empire, no mother metropolis who sent them. They needed a surrogate mother. And the surrogate mother initially was the British Empire. So, and on from then, throughout the history of Zionist colonization, Zionism needed the sponsorship of a surrogate mother empire. And it made a Faustian deal with all those empires, beginning with the British Empire, briefly with the French colonial empire, and latterly and currently with the American imperialism. And that is, and this was actually foreshadowed by Herzl. I think Tony may have mentioned it. Herzl actually devised this strategy. We will be a bastion against the natives of Asia on behalf, and at that time he said Europe, he meant European imperialism. He didn't think of American imperialism at that time because it wasn't really on the map. And this has persisted. Zionism and the Zionist regime of Israel is an essential and important ally of whichever imperialism is hegemonic in the region and in the world. And this role of the Zionist regime is not only a local one, but has become a more global role of Israel as a junior partner of American imperialist hegemony of the world. And hence you can see that the close relationship between Netanyahu and Trump. And this is only a personal expression of something which is much deeper, and which is, I mean, if there is a special relationship of any country with the United States, it's not poor declining Britain, but the Israeli watchdog of imperialism. Okay, so this is my short primer of what Zionism is. Why should we oppose it? Well, this is the conclusion of what I am saying. It is, first of all, if you are an anti-imperialist, if you reject imperialist domination and hegemony anywhere in the world, and especially in the region of the Middle East, then you should oppose the main junior partner of imperialism in that area. So this is number one. Anti-Zionism is a necessary consequence of anti-imperialism. The second one reverts to the nature of Zionism itself, what it is not vis-a-vis the world, but what it is vis-a-vis its colonial victims. You should reject and oppose Zionism because the Zionist regime is an institutionalized armed robbery of Palestinian land. I repeat, the Zionist regime is an institutionalized armed robbery of Palestinian lands. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. As Tina has said, this discussion does not take place in a vacuum. It's not a purely academic discussion. The question of Zionism has been raised consistently in the Labour Party, but in many ways in the worst possible way. Indeed, if you mention the word Zionist, you're almost certain to get it suspended, if not expelled, because Zionism and Jew are used interchangeably. And one of the points of this discussion and talk is to make a very clear separation between being Jewish and being a Zionist. And the question which arises is not only what is Zionism, but why make the emphasis on Zionism? It's Shami Chakrabarti in a report on racism and anti-Semitism in the Labour Party said, and I'm quoting, that surely it is better to use the modern universal language of human rights, be it of discrimination, segregation, occupation, or persecution. So why do we insist that Zionism is a useful category with which to understand what is happening in Palestine and Israel today? I would give this analogy. It's quite a simple one. In the case of apartheid in South Africa, would anyone say that we should solely have concentrated on people's human rights, the inevitable discrimination and so on, but not said anything about the system, the ideology of apartheid? I think most people would say that that is ridiculous, that you cannot separate the two. And so the same is true of the State of Israel. That Zionism is the ideology which underpins everything that takes place in it. So the segregation, the fact that people live in separate spheres by and large, that education is separate, but also the very concepts that are used in Israel, the idea of redeeming the land, redemption, which in essence means that once Zionist organizations acquired that land, it was never to be released, or Arabs were never to be allowed access to that land. So there are a whole number of racist and apartheid ideas which are bound up in Zionism itself. And the second thing about Zionism is it isn't a Jewish ideology. There is this belief that being Zionist and being Jewish are interchangeable. In the words of the chief rabbi, you would no more separate off the city of London from Britain than you would Zionism from being Jewish. But of course, that is not correct. The first Zionists were not Jewish, they were Christians. I mean, going back to Cromwell, 300 years or so. But in the 19th century, Zionism became a very fashionable ideology, not amongst Jews. When Zionism arose amongst Jews, it was met with fierce hostility. But amongst Christian imperialists, Lord Shaftesbury, Lord Palmerston, George Eliot with her novel Daniel Deronda, Disraeli, there were many others, Napoleon, Ernest Laharan, the secretary to Napoleon III. They were all Zionists, and the reason why was quite simple, that if you wanted a settler state near or adjacent to the Suez Canal, the strategic route then to India, then having a Jewish state with the biblical justification was very useful. Zionism itself amongst Jewish people really did not take off till around 1880, 1881, after the assassination of Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia. And a consequence of that assassination was a wave of pogroms beginning in Odessa in 1881. And this is really when Zionism took off, because Zionism was a reaction, and there's no doubt that Zionism was a reaction to anti-Semitism, but it was not the typical reaction, which was to form, in many places, self-defense squads to fight off the pogromists. On the contrary, Zionism from the very start accepted the basic argument of the anti-Semites, which was basically that Jews were a separate nation. They could not assimilate or integrate into the nations amongst whom they lived. And it was better off that the country was better off if they were no longer part of it. And the Zionists accepted that. And this was not unique amongst all oppressed peoples. The same happened in the United States with Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement. The racists said, you're different. And the victims, or some of them, said, yes, we are different. We can't live together. And what we need to do is to form a separate state. In the case of Garvey, I mean, he went so far as to establish links with the Ku Klux Klan. And I read recently a statement that he said of the KKK that they had lynched racial pride into the Negro. So, I mean, these ideas were fairly common. Zionism was amongst it. And if I can quote from Jacob Klatskin, who was an early Zionist, he edited the Zionist newspaper Developed at 1909 to 11, and he was a co-founder of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He said, if we do not admit the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, we deny the rightfulness of our own nationalism. Instead, and I go on, instead of establishing societies for defense against the anti-Semites who want to reduce our rights, we should establish societies for defense against our friends who desire to defend our rights. So that's in many ways symbolized the attitude of Zionism. The founder of political Zionism was a man called Theodor Herzl. And Theodor Herzl adopted very much the same. He was a Viennese journalist, and he was their correspondent in Paris. and he founded the World Zionist Organization, or the Zionist Organization, at a congress in Basel in 1897. And there's a quite interesting story. The first congress was supposed to be in Munich, in Germany. The only problem is that the local Jewish population rose up in protest and demanded that it be moved. They said, this is a form of anti-Semitism. You want us to go, and that's why you're holding this congress here. Well, I could give another, amongst many examples, when Theodor Herzl, he traveled around Europe trying to win over the ruling classes in various countries to the ideas of Zionism, that the Jews should move to Palestine. And he met the Pope, he met Victor Emmanuel, the King of Hungary, he met the Kaiser of Germany, and he also met, amongst others, the Grand Duke of Baden, who was the uncle of the Kaiser. And he was discussing it, and the Grand Duke of Baden said to him that, I fully support you, I just have one reservation. If I come out publicly in your support, people will accuse me of anti-Semitism. And that was the feeling at the time. If you supported Zionism, then you were an anti-Semite because you wanted to be rid of the Jews. And that's, I think, interesting when it comes to the Labour Party today, when the argument is if you oppose Zionism, if you have anything critical to say about Israel, then you must be anti-Semitic. Historically, it was the case that if you were a supporter of Zionism, then the chances are you were also anti-Semitic. And actually, if you look at that today, that is still the same. If you look at who are the best friends of Zionism today, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who won a general election on the basis of a campaign against George Soros, the world Jewish financier who was pulling the strings, or Donald Trump. The ideas that he put together, he won an election in 2016 using a whole number of anti-Semitic tropes, including 3 Jewish bankers on a famous poster with a Star of David attached to them. More recently, he told the Hanukkah celebration to Jews in the White House that Israel was your country, and he's repeated that consistently. That Jews should be loyal to Israel because that is their real home. Indeed, when he was telling 4 black Congress women that they should go back home, he added, for good measure, that they were anti-Semites because, of course, they hated Israel. As I say, the founder of Zionism was Theodor Herzl, and he pressed. Can I share the screen, do you think, Chris? Okay, this is an extract from the complete diaries of Theodor Herzl, and there are 4 volumes of them. And this is on page 6. And he said, in Paris, then, I gained a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism. Let me put this in context. This was at the time, was written at the time of the Dreyfus affair. It was the major anti-Semitic incident, if you like, affair in Europe. It lasted, nearly 10 years between the conviction and the eventual acquittal of Dreyfus. And what was the conclusion of Herzl, who I say was a correspondent for a Viennese newspaper? In Paris, then, I gained a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and make allowances for. Above all, I recognized the emptiness and futility of attempts to combat anti-Semitism. And that is one of the main things, that Zionism starts from the belief that you cannot actually fight anti-Semitism. You have to accept it because it's inherent in every non-Jew, in every Gentile. And in Britain, Sir Samuel Montague, who was the MP for Whitechapel, 1885 to 1900, who was one of the leaders of the Anglo-Jewish community, argued or put forward, and I say it's as true today as it was then, that is it not a suspicious fact that those who have no love for the Jews and those who are pronounced anti-Semites all seem to welcome the Zionist proposals and aspirations? And of course, that is true, that almost invariably, if someone is an anti-Semite, there will be a Zionist, because what better way of being rid of your unwanted Jews than sending them to Israel. Well, one of the aspects of Zionism which I want to touch on is its attitude to emancipation. Zionism represented a rejection of Jewish emancipation. If you remember, the first country which emancipated the Jews was France in the French Revolution in 1789. A very famous saying from, I think it was Count Stanislaw de Ternay, I can never pronounce it, when he said, "To the Jews as a nation, nothing, but to the Jews as an individuals, everything." And Zionism rejected that, and it rejected that for a very simple reason. That it saw that once the gates of emancipation, once the emancipation had opened the gates of the ghetto, once the Jews became free to mix and to assimilate, they would disappear as a nation. And Zionism, above all, is a movement of Jewish supremacy that sees as the ultimate goal the establishment of a Jewish racial state. Emancipation was a direct threat to it. And that's why Zionists forever saw in anti-Semitism something that was good. I mean, I'll give you a few quotes, starting with Theodor Herzl, because he was the major figure. And I'll give you 3 quotes. He said, "Anti-Semitism probably contains the divine will to good." Why? Because it forces us to close ranks, unites us through pressure, and through our unity will make us free. And he also said of it, "It will not harm the Jews." That's anti-Semitism, mind you. "I consider it to be a movement useful to the Jewish character. It represents the education of a group by the masses. Education is accomplished by hard knocks." And that can be found in his founding pamphlet called The Jewish State, or Die Judenstaat. And he also went on to say, "We ought to be thankful to our oppressors that they closed the gates of assimilation to us and took care that our people were concentrated and not dispersed." And that was the attitude. And that was not only the attitude of Herzl to the anti-Semites. And if I had more time, I would explain that Herzl, as I say, traveled around Europe. One of his last journeys was to the Russian, the ministers of the Russian Tsar, Count von Plehve and Count von Wiet. Plehve had organized the Black Hundreds, a group of anti-Semites, a gang of anti-Semites who had perpetrated many a massacre, including the famous Kishinev pogrom in 1903, sorry. 3 months later, Herzl was meeting with von Plehve in Russia, promising that the Zionist movement would do nothing to criticize the Tsarist government in exchange for their support. So what happened in Russia, when any revolutionary, any socialist, any liberal organization was outlawed, the Zionist movement almost alone was legalized. And when Herzl started trying to convert or persuade von Plehve, he said, "You do not need to preach to me. You are preaching to a convert." And the Jewish revolutionaries, the Bund, which was a large Jewish organization at the time in Russia, was absolutely outraged, as were most Jewish workers, because Herzl was parleying with a person who was the most hated symbol of all. But that was in the early part of the century. But of course, people say to each other, well, the Jews have always wanted to go to Palestine. Zionism has been integral to being Jewish throughout the centuries. And all I have to say is that's absolutely nonsense. In fact, Palestine, because there was nothing to stop Jews going to Palestine, they didn't need a passport, there were no borders, people could quite freely emigrate. When the Jews of Russia responded to the pogroms by emigration, and between the middle of the 19th century and the First World War, approximately 2.5 million Jews emigrated. Where did they emigrate? Not to Palestine, but to the United States. And some of them stopped off at Britain and got no further, 150,000 or so. Probably 1% at best went to move to Palestine. So that just goes to show that given the choice, Jews will go anywhere but Israel today or Palestine. The idea that it's somehow the natural home of anyone who is Jewish is an anti-Semitic concept above all. But the Zionists, I mean, I don't have time, of course, to go into the history of the Zionist relationship during the 1930s with the Nazis. It's clearly a controversial topic. Just to say this, there was nothing different in the Zionist reaction to the rise of the Nazis and Hitler than their reaction to anti-Semitism historically. It was on a par. Of course, they didn't foresee the Holocaust. One won't lay that at their feet. But their reaction, for instance, in opposition to the boycott of Nazi Germany, whereas the Jewish masses overwhelmingly, that included the Zionist rank and file, supported a boycott of Nazi Germany. The Zionists were busy negotiating Havara, a trade transfer, not in order to save German Jews, it had to be, because it only applied to the richest Jews anyway. You had to have £1,000 in capital, which today would be about, I don't know, £50,000. But because Palestine was operating a policy called selectivity, so only a few Jews could go there anyway. The attitude of Zionists at the time to the rise of the Nazis was actually that it was an extremely good thing. And I'll just quote two people. One was Emil Ludwig, who was a world-famous biographer, who expressed the general attitude of the Zionist movement when he said, Hitler will be forgotten in a few years, but it will have a beautiful monument in Palestine. You know, the coming of the Nazis was rather a welcome thing. So many of our German Jews were caught in the treacherous current between the silo of assimilation, the Charybodis of a nodding acquaintance with Jewish things. Thousands who seemed completely lost to Judaism were brought back to the fold by Hitler. And for that, I am personally very grateful to him. And just to complete that, the Zionist national poet Chaim Nachman Bialik volunteered that Hitler has perhaps saved German Jewry, which was being assimilated into annihilation. Of course, that is extremely ironic given the Holocaust and what happened. But Zionists had really had no problem when Arthur Rupin, who was the key figure in Palestine Zionism, who was the director of the Palestine office from 1908 onwards. He was the father of land settlement. When a friend called him an anti-Semite, he responded, I have already established here in my diary that I despise the cancers of Judaism more than does the worst anti-Semite. And that's to say, what's the general attitude of Zionism towards anti-Semitism? Zionism rejected the idea of living with non-Jews. It accepted the principles of the Nuremberg laws of 1935, the most lethal legal instrument that had been known to man, as Norman Cohen, who wrote Warrant for Genocide, said. Other things about Zionism. Zionism began really, I mean, let me say that why should we have an understanding of Zionism? Let me say that if the Palestinian Liberation Organization had a true understanding of Zionism, it wouldn't have signed the Oslo Accords. Zionism began from the idea of a land without a people, for a people without a land. Zionism never had any intention of negotiating a separate Palestinian state or relinquishing any part of what it calls the Holy Land, Eretz Yisrael. The Oslo Accords were, if you like, a means of buying time, but the Palestinian leadership bought into that, and as a result, probably the worst catastrophe since the Nakba occurred in the early 1990s as a result of that and the formation of a quisling government in Ramallah. I'll finish.
Up now. Oh, there you go.
I'll finish by quoting Rudolf Verber. Rudolf Verber, for those who do not know, and most people won't have heard of his name, was one of 4 Jewish people who managed to escape from Auschwitz, and he escaped and reached Slovakia with his fellow Alfred Wetzler. on April, I think, the 23rd, 1944. And he revealed the secret of Auschwitz, because Auschwitz was not known until then, or if it was known, its existence was disregarded. He had a photographic memory and copied down into what became the Auschwitz protocols, the layout of Auschwitz and what had happened there. And the Auschwitz protocols were suppressed by the leader or the leadership of Hungarian Zionism, which resulted partly in the catastrophe whereby in the very last stages of the war, 500,000 Jews nearly went to the gas chambers. And he wrote, "I am a Jew. In spite of that, indeed because of that, I accuse certain Jewish leaders of one of the most ghastly deeds of the war. This small group of quislings knew what was happening to their brethren in Hitler's gas chambers and bought their own lives with the price of silence. Among them was Dr. Kastner. I was able to give Hungarian Zionist leaders 3 weeks' notice that Eichmann planned to send 1 million of their Jews to his gas chambers. Kastner went to Eichmann and told him, I know of your plans, spare some Jews of my choice and I shall keep quiet." That essay was from Rudolf Weber, who was an anti-Zionist Jew who went to Israel and promptly moved first to Britain and then to Canada. Thank you very much. That is really only a fragment, but I've tried to cover some of the basic concepts of what Zionism is. Thank you.
Hi there. I enjoyed that. That was very good. I was surprised how little I knew about the history of it. I was particularly surprised about Tony's contribution with regards to the history of what makes an anti-Semite and anti-Semite, as it were, because if you look at today with the Labour Party, you'd have the impression that the situation is completely reversed. My question is, I don't really know how to put it. Is it possible to be an anti-Zionist without actually calling for the state of Israel to be abolished? In other words, to go back to the United Nations 1967 borders and leave it at that. Supposing you didn't feel very strong on it, but you still supported the right of Israel to exist. Does that make you a Zionist? If I hope that makes sense. When you look at Jewish Voice for Labour and what they say about Jews and Zionism, or you often find that if you post articles from them, to, a lot of Labour members on the right will say they don't speak for all Jews, and so you end up in this what you might call the wrong type of Jew without saying it as such. And I often, perhaps one of the panel could answer whether that is actually a form of anti-Semitism in itself.
Hi, thanks for having this presentation. I think one of the things that has to be addressed around the issue of Zionism and the role of Zionism in the labor movement is the role it plays in organizing against critics of Israel and against the Zionist ideology. Because in the United States, the AFL-CIO, of course, supports Israel and actually has a Zionist ideology. And this prevents a debate and discussion in the labor movement about the role of Israel and Zionism. So I don't think we can, and this has been an historic issue in the United States, that people who are critical now of Zionism are being accused of being anti-Semites and is used politically. So I think, and I think the same thing has happened in Britain. There was an organized campaign to get rid of critics of Israel who were anti-Zionist, saying that they were anti-Semitic. So I think there has to be a campaign in the labor movement in the unions, both in the United States and Britain and around the world, and Canada as well, that the fight against Zionism is a fight against a racist ideology, and also that the premise of the US unions are equality for all, secular equality, the rights of all workers. And the reality is when you support a Zionist regime, you're supporting a discrimination against non-Jews, of course, Palestinians. So I think there has to be a kind of a political campaign internationally around those issues in the working class, in the labor movement, ideologically.
So Moshe wants to answer some of these.
Yes, I would like to answer 3 questions, 2 of which were voiced here on Zoom, and the other one was on questions, on the questions and answers panel. Does anti-Zionism imply opposition to the state of Israel as such? I think, you know, this is akin to the trap question. Are you against the right of Israel to exist? And if you're an anti-Zionist, they expect you to either fumble or give the wrong answer. Well, in my view, no state has a right to exist as such. I mean, the right to exist is a human right. And it is not about for me, not about the existence of the state of Israel, but about the Zionist regime. What I and my comrades have been advocating for the last many decades, since the organization that I helped to found, Matpen, was founded in 1962, almost since the very beginning, what we advocated was the overthrow of the Zionist regime. So it is not just that we are against the present Israeli government. It is not, on the other hand, that we are against the right of the state of Israel to exist as some exception. We are against any right of any state to exist. It is not something God-given. No state has a God-given right to exist. But this is not the question. The question is the question of the regime. What we are advocating is the overthrow of the Zionist regime of the state of Israel. This brings me to another question that was raised by a comrade, I think, Guy Saha, on the question and answer, which made the analogy with South Africa. I'm afraid the comparison is not very optimistic for people like us who are against the Zionist colonization enterprise. It is very often assumed that the South African apartheid regime was overthrown by international public pressure. This is only true to a very partial extent. The thing about the apartheid regime, what contributed mostly to its downfall, the international pressure played a role, and it is undeniable that it helped. But in that case, what clinched the case was, first of all, the military defeat of the South African regime in Angola and in Southwest Africa. But more than that, it was the fact that the regime could not deal with the majority of the population, because under that regime, as I pointed out, the majority of the population were oppressed, exploited, but at the same time, essential for the existing regime. It was they were its labor, but he couldn't get rid of them. The case of Zionism is different. The Zionist colonization regime has an option, unfortunately, which the South African apartheid regime did not have, and that is another major Nakba, another major expulsion, exiling of the remaining Palestinian people in between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. This is always a danger. And so I think what we should mobilize public opinion for is to be ready and prepared to oppose that impending danger, because it is clear that the Zionist regime did not ever seriously accept the idea of two states. This was a deception. It is interested in one state under Zionist control, but there it has a problem of at least half of the population being non-Jewish, being mainly Arab. And the resolution of that contradiction from the point of view of the Zionist regime is to use any possible opportunity, any opportune hour, as it is called in Zionist discourse, to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible. I think we should be prepared for this to be attempted whenever there is an international crisis. I'm not speaking purely in a speculative form. There are known plans, not least by a previous Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, and the existing one, the present one, Benjamin Netanyahu, of getting rid, actually expelling a major part of the Palestinian population. So this is the kind of mobilization that we should be seriously engaged in, to mobilize public opinion against the danger of another major expulsion of the Palestinian people. Finally, it is true, as comrade Steve has pointed out from the United States, that Zionism serves to mobilize the working class and generally public opinion in support of imperialism. And this is really the secret of what this huge campaign against, the Labour Party, against Jeremy Corbyn, against those who supported him, on the false accusations of anti-Semitism. It is a mistake to suppose that this is purely the work of the Israel advocacy groups, the so-called pro-Israel lobby, such as We Stand by Israel, the Jewish labor movement, which is committed to advocate for Israel, and Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is constitutionally committed to advocate for Israel. It is not purely they who are responsible for this campaign. They provide the theme. I mean, if they didn't participate in accusations of anti-Semitism, nobody would take it seriously. But the main, let us say, energy and the main drive comes from the establishment, from the pro-imperialist establishment within the Labour Party and those parts of the Labour Party that are loyal to the British establishment, and the British establishment itself outside the Labour Party, which includes the mainstream media, the BBC, and the press, the prejudiced press that we have here, including the hypocritical so-called left-wing Guardian. This is it is they who are really the main driving force of this campaign against the Labour Party under the guise of accusations of anti-Semitism, which are false, by the way. The way you can see that they are false and really exaggerated is that they don't give any quantification. They don't tell you, they make the impression that the Labour Party is riddled with anti-Semitism. However defined, it's badly defined, by the way. But the question is not only of definition, it's also quantification. any reasonable accusation should be accompanied by quantification. How many anti-Semites are there in Labour? Are there more anti-Semites than pedophiles? Are there more anti-Semites in the Labour Party than wife beaters? Are there more anti-Semites in the Labour Party than in the Conservative Party? They don't actually give you these data. I mean, are there 100 anti-Semites or 100,000? They avoid this question, and this is a hallmark of a false accusation. If it doesn't give you, if it makes vague accusation without actually quantifying it, that is a hallmark of a lie.
One of the most surprising and striking things about the anti-Semitism witch hunt is that there are actually no victims of this anti-Semitism. The Labour Party is overridden with anti-Semitism. There are anti-Semites everywhere, but the only victim that I know of anti-Semitism, if anyone watched the BBC Panorama, is Labour anti-Semitic. The only victim was the person who came on first. You remember Ella Rose, who, if there was any justice in this world, she would be nominated for an Oscar for her performance, which was truly magnificent. But apart from that, there are no victims. And the same with the Equality Human Rights Commission's report. It accuses two people, Pam Bromley and Ken Livingstone, of being guilty of harassment. But it's a very strange legal definition of harassment, which actually doesn't have a named victim. It's simply a generic quality. In reality, of course, the anti-Semitism witch hunt is not about anti-Semitism. In fact, I'll go further. It's based on the idea that all Jews support Zionism, and therefore, if you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semitic. Well, that in itself is a racist anti-Semitic idea. So the witch hunt is actually inevitably, inherently racist. And it's no wonder that not only Jewish people, but of course, many Black and many Muslim people are the victims of it. But we also I think you have to look, if you're sensible. When has the right of the Labour Party ever been bothered about racism? When has Tom Watson ran the by-election campaign in 2004 in Birmingham Hodge Hill. The campaign consisted of demonising asylum seekers and saying that the Liberal Democrats were soft on asylum seekers. I mean, this is the man who defended the racist Labour MP Phil Willis in 2010, who had run an election campaign based on making the white folks angry. You might remember the High Court removed him for lying from the House of Parliament, and Tom Watson wrote how upset he'd lost sleep apparently over this case. I mean, the idea that these right wingers are concerned about anti-Semitism really is for the birds. But it's very, very useful in providing a moral legitimacy to the campaign to overthrow Corbyn. Quite simply, when Corbyn was elected and he was seen as someone who was anti-NATO, anti-war, and so on, I mean, the alarm bells, I'm sure, rang from Langley in Virginia, the CIA headquarters, to the Israeli army's headquarters in Tel Aviv, stopping off in London at MI5 headquarters as well. And clearly the anti-Semitism narrative, and it took some time to develop, was seen as the most useful weapon that they could deploy. And really that is what it is. So we learned that 25 Jewish people were currently suspended or under investigation. I mean, what kind of campaign against anti-Semitism is it that targets, to a large extent, Jewish people? It's a nonsense because, of course, we are the wrong sort of Jews. As regards the question of if you're an anti-Zionist, can you be opposed to the state of Israel? I think, yes, if you're talking about Israel as a Jewish supremacist state, then clearly you can't be an anti-Zionist if you support its existence, even within the 1967 borders. You're opposed to the fundamental nature of a state that is based on one section of the population. Israel is a state of the Jews. It's a state of it's Jewish citizens in practice, not all of its citizens. And that's why in every peace negotiation, one of the first things they propose is a land swap with the future Palestinian entity, in which they can transfer the major concentrations of Palestinian Israelis inside Israel, the triangle in particular, over to a new fledgling Palestinian state. Palestinians in Israel, of which there are 20%, are really tolerated guests. I mean, although they have citizenship, it's a citizenship that is almost meaningless in terms of their rights. And the Jewish nation state law has put that down in concrete, as it were. So the answer is, if you're an anti-Zionist, you believe in a secular state, a state that doesn't depend on one particular ethnicity. Although, of course, it's very useful, just like in Ireland and South Africa, to have a section of the population which identifies with that state based on that ethnicity makes it extremely hard to overthrow. And South Africa was difficult enough, but overthrowing Zionism in Israel, I think, will be that much harder because of the support it has garnered. And the fact that really, I mean, the reason why anti-Semitism has such a play morally is, of course, because of the Holocaust. Israel trades on the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust. We all know that.
Hi, well, thanks very much. I mean, I'm glad to salute Moshe. As a pair of old-timers, we became anti-Zionist. I mean, I grew up in Israel. I came there as a Zionist, as a youth in my teenage years. But I became an anti-Zionist before the '67 war.
Thanks to him,
Thanks to Moshe, where we met at Jabral's house in Haifa. And what I'm glad to say is that although we were a very small handful of people that constituted Matzpen, and many of you may be familiar with that, but if you're not, there is plenty of history about Matzpen that is available on YouTube. And but the interesting thing is that the influence on the Israeli politics, in particularly in the left, in the real left, has been enormous, well beyond the small number of members of Matzpen at the time. And one thing that I can say, I mean, this ghost about anti-Semitism, because anybody that is against the politics of Israel, it's wielded as an anti-Semite. Well, I can tell you, I'm not an anti-Semite. I don't hate myself. I don't think my wife does that. And neither my children, which were born there. And when they throw this issue about anti-Semitism, I say, well, if this is the only thing that you have to say in defense of the politics of Israel, really, we are a long step ahead of you. Because, I mean, they have no arguments about the issues of racism, about passing laws that are continuously, basically, it's like a state of one people and the ones that we need to get rid of, so-called. And this is ongoing. I mean, it's not new. It didn't start in 1967. And it goes way back to Second World War and the establishment of the country. I mean, I, like Moshe and others, have been living in the US now for over 40 years. And I can tell you this comes up time and time again. And my answer to that is, well, if anti-Semitism is the only thing you have to say about that, the concept of being a solid, democratic, secular, and hopefully socialist state, then you have no argument. That's all that you can say. I mean, that's all your defense.
Good morning, comrades. I should apologize if I'm a little bit incoherent. I'm calling you from Australia. Thanks to COVID, I'm stuck here. But yeah, thanks again to all the speakers. That was excellent contributions. I have a long-standing interest in the issue. My father served in Palestine at the end of the British Mandate, and actually in the Haifa Volunteers. He was one of the very last to leave Haifa, and was, of course, a witness to the ethnic cleansing of Haifa and many other atrocities that were carried out by the Zionist terrorist gangs that were carrying out the ethnic cleansing. But I could go on about that for a long time, but my question really is a practical one. Back in the UK, like many others, I was a victim of the witch hunt. One of the items of evidence that I received in my questioning document was a warning that I made to comrades some months ago, actually a couple of years ago, of infiltration within the Labour Party of, I call them David Collier style Zionist trollers. I think everyone knows who the kind of people I'm talking about. And some of these individuals, and this is in the West Country, are pretty unpleasant people. They're basically fanatical Zionists, and they're linked to all the people you expect: David Collier, Jonathan Hoffman, and many other unpleasant far-right individuals. My approach to dealing with them myself has been to basically a bit like how one would deal with fascists, because that, as far as I can see practically, that's what they are. They, going back to the days when I was in anti-fascist action in the 1980s and so on. And my approach has been to them is basically to name and shame and publicize them, to show their links to these other far-right people. So yeah, I would like to hear from the panelists. Some practical questions about combating Zionism now for today, combating these really unpleasant individuals who, pride themselves in trolling other people publicly and smearing them with, claims of anti-Semitism. So over to you. Thank you.
It seems to me that if we're arguing that Zionism is a racist ideology, and we know that there's a lot of Zionism in the Labour Party, then in a sense the Labour Party is a racist party. That's a logical conclusion of that, and you can't fight racism in the Labour Party if you're not going to take on the ideas of Zionism. And that's the problem, I think, that we've got. But obviously that requires us to think a lot about Israel, which is what's happening here. So I really want to, my point was, if you compare South Africa with America, New Zealand, Australia, all colonial settler states that Moshe mentioned in his part of his talk, at some point, at some stage, you're going to accept they exist. I mean, we're not trying to abolish South Africa, America, New Zealand, or Australia. We kind of accept their existence. Now, you could argue that Israel is different because Israel is still an expansionist state. Its colonization hasn't finished, whereas the other ones, their colonization finished. But at somewhere down the track, somewhere historically, a colonial state becomes a stable state, and you don't try to abolish it, you try to democratize it in a certain sense, which is what happened in South Africa. I mean, it was the democratization of South Africa that took place. So you might say Israel is different because of its expansionist nature. It hasn't stopped its expansionism, but there might be an argument for saying that the problem that we've got is that the argument is if you accept that Israel exists, then the argument is against Israel as a Zionist state, not as a democratic state. In other words, is it possible for Israel to be democratized and for its link with Zionism to be broken? And if you're going to do that, you're going to need the 20% of the Arab population of Israel to be part of that process, obviously, because they're the victims of a Zionist Israel. Now, I know Tony doesn't agree with this, but I think we'll go over the argument. Do we have to get rid of Israel, or can it be, is there some point where it can be democratized? In other words, you can have a democratic process, which would include, of course, recognizing the right of a Palestinian state to exist. I do, without doing that. So is there a program that says we're against a Zionist Israel because it's racist, but we want to see a democratic Israel? And the only way that can come about is if the working class and the Arab populations transform the state from the nature of the state that it is. So I want to just ask whether that is a possible way. It's a different approach on it. I know Tony's not going to agree with it, but I'd just like to throw that into the equation. Moshe, I think, is.
Can Israel, in essence, be normalized? Is really what you're saying, Steve Freeman. Would that be correct? He's disappeared now.
I just made him. Yes, he did. Democratic.
That's what I took to be his argument. Firstly, I don't even think the United States and Australia have been normalized. I think part of the behavior of the United States and its attitude both to its own, to black people and of course indigenous people, as well as its adventures abroad, are partly shaped by its settler colonial origins. And the same is true of Australia. It has never come to terms with its Aboriginal population. But Israel is an active settler colonial state, not only in the occupied territories, but internally. There's a continuous program of Judaization in the Negev, in the Galilee, to restrict the expansion of existing Israeli-Palestinian towns and villages. It's Zionism as an ideology, which is quite unlike most, certainly Australia and United States don't have that ideology now, but the ideology of making the state more Jewish at the expense of those who are non-Jewish, even though they are citizens, formally at least, it is pretty unique to Israel. But Israel is an active colonial power. And I was thinking about the question of expansion, because that was part of one of the questions which was raised. Well, originally the Zionist program was based on a concept known as the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael. And that goes up to the Litani in Lebanon and across the Euphrates and down to, I think it's the brook of the Nile in the Bible. So there's actually plenty of space left to conquer. But in practice, what would happen, supposing that Israel managed to expel its Palestinian population, and so its natural border was the Jordan River, which it populated with settlers? I have no doubt at all whatsoever it would then come into conflict with Jordan, and there would be some pretext or other in order to start raiding Jordan and then other neighboring countries. So Israel is still an expansionist state. It's not a state which I think will ever be normalized because of its situation in the Middle East as much as anything else. The question is how you overthrow the Zionist regime. And I don't think that's possible by the Palestinians themselves. Other questions, one was I'm having a look at the questions and answers, Tom O'Connor. Do the panelists draw similarities between Israel, the whites in South Africa during apartheid, and unionists in Northern Ireland? Undoubtedly so. The development of the British Mandate from about 1922 onwards almost parallel the developments in Northern Ireland. And it was Ronald Storr, the first military governor of Jerusalem, who said that the Zionist settlement was a little Royal Ulster in a sea of hostile Pan-Arabism. Certainly the British understood that in all sorts of ways. Remember, I mean, Balfour, Arthur Balfour, who initiated or signed the Balfour Declaration, first saw active service as the chief secretary in Ireland, where he was known as Bloody Balfour, owing to the fact that British troops shot 3 demonstrators dead in Mitchelstown, County Cork. He was a seasoned imperialist before he ever heard of Zionism. And of course, he transferred his practices in Ireland. He came over here, he became prime minister and then foreign secretary. And to him, certainly, the Zionist settlement was a continuation of the Irish plantation in a way. It was a new Ulster in the Middle East, a strategic ally, which was of use. So yes, there were. Similarly in South Africa, I mean, there were differences. South Africa, as Moshe said, exploited black labor. It didn't try to exclude it. But many of the myths in South Africa were much the same. One of the major myths is that the white South Africans didn't displace black South Africans, because the black South Africans came to South Africa as a result of the industrialization, the provision of employment on the cotton fields and in the wine and so on. But it was an empty land before the settlers came. That was also, of course, one of the myths of the Zionists, which was untrue, of course. I don't know what other information on the UK Israel lobby. Well, there's BICOM is the main Israel lobby, but there are many, many other players, and we can, I think, now include the Community Security Trust in the campaign against anti-Semitism. An anonymous attendee has said, it was directed at Moshe, but I'd also like to answer. Do you believe in one state or 2 states? I am firmly opposed to 2 states. I'm firmly opposed to partition, whether it's in Ireland or whether it's in Palestine. I mean, as James Connolly said in Ireland, partition would create a carnival of reaction on both sides of the border. That would be the case if there was a two-state solution in Palestine. In reality, why would you want to have a two-state? What is it that prevents Jews or Israelis and Palestinians living together? I can't see any argument other than the racist argument, which says that Palestinians and Jews cannot cohabit together. That is part of the myth of the settler colonialism. So I firmly reject the idea, and I'm in favor of a secular democratic state. Okay, thank you.
Neil asked how to combat this attack of fake accusations of anti-Semitism. Well, I said so, years ago, and I published an article under the title, "Don't Apologize, Attack."
Mm-hmm.
I think it is a cardinal strategic mistake to try to apologize. Yes, there is anti-Semitism, of course, there are pedophiliacs in the Labour Party. But if the Labour Party has been accused of being rife with pedophilia, then you know that it is a fake accusation. It is not. It is not serious. There are no numbers attached to this, as I pointed out before. So don't apologize, attack. Is there a radicalization in Israel? I want to mention something that most people who don't follow the Israeli press are not aware of. Since the middle of July, there has been enormous huge wave of demonstrations in Israel. You hear about demonstrations in Kazakhstan, you hear about demonstrations in Tajikistan, you hear demonstrations in the Ukraine, you hear about Thailand, but there seems to be an embargo about news which Israelis feel as the biggest wave of demonstrations. They've been persistent and huge. They try to suppress this wave of demonstration because of the corona crisis, but all they manage is to make, instead of one huge demonstration, the peak was 10,000 people, a lot of small demonstrations. Unfortunately, I mean, they are not left-wing as such. I mean, let us say, what can be described as the left of Israeli politics has not become stronger in this demonstration, nor has they become weaker. If anything, they signal some drift from the Likud of Netanyahu to more right-wing parties. But the thrust of these demonstrations is against the huge corruption that has been revealed and the ineptitude of the regime to deal with the corona crisis. This is not reported at all. There is a conspiracy of silence in the British press about this. They report from Israel, they report all sorts of trivialities. They report little gossip things, but they don't report about this, something that Israelis sense as an enormous wave of demonstration, the most important since the great Siemens strike in the early 1950s. Can Israel change? I don't think this is possible in the short term. I think Tony is too pessimistic in intimating that it can never change. I don't think, never is I think too strong. It cannot change in the short term, and let me tell you why. There are few laws in history, but one of the actual laws of history is that whenever there is a colonization of the type that Zionism represents, that is to say, colonization based on the labor power of the settlers themselves, a new nation comes into existence. There is an Australian nation, an American nation, etc., etc. There is also an Israeli Hebrew nation, as I would call it, because this is what it used to call itself until shortly after 1948, and it is characterized by its everyday language, which is unique to us. It is the Hebrew language. This nation has its own working class. As Tony rightly said, the working class in Israel does not support the overthrow of the Zionist regime at the moment. It is an exploited class, but it has a privilege as an exploited class of a privileged nation. I think that without the participation of this working class, Zionism cannot be overthrown. But at the moment, and in the near future, there is no reason for this working class to overthrow the Zionist regime and lose its privilege of being part of a privileged nation without changing its status as an exploited class. This is not, I mean, so from an exploited class with national privilege, it would become an exploited class without national privilege. This is no deal that the Israeli working class is likely to make. The only context in which the Zionist regime can be overthrown, and it can only be overthrown by its own people, by a working class, majority of which is Hebrew, in the context of a socialist transformation of the region. This is not likely to happen anytime soon, but we are socialists. We believe in world socialism, and in particular in socialism in the region of the Middle East, of the Arab East. In this situation, the Israeli working class, the Hebrew working class, can be offered a deal of exchanging its status as an exploited class of a privileged nation and becoming part of the ruling class of a socialist region and give up its national privileges. This is a deal that can become attractive. It is this context, I think, that a resolution of the problem can occur. I think the two-state solution was from the beginning a deception. A one-state solution without a socialist change is impossible. The only one-state solution in the foreseeable future is the one-state solution in Zionist terms, which means expulsion of a huge number of additional Palestinians. There is a possibility of integrating the both national groups that exist now in Israel, the Hebrew nation and the Palestinian Arab part of the Arab nation, in a socialist union or federation of the region. This is not going to happen anytime soon. And in this respect, I think Tony is right, but it's not right, in my view, in saying it is never going to happen. It's like saying socialism is never going to happen. And in this case, what are we doing here?
Very well summed up. I was thinking that there's a rule of history that nothing stays the same. Everything is in flux, and it all depends on our forces as well. I would just like to sum up, just right from the beginning of where Moshe defined Zionism, which I think is very useful for us to get our head around, a short definition of what Zionism is and why we oppose it. Firstly, you said, ideologically, it's based on the belief that all Jews constitute a single nation. And secondly, this alleged nation has the right to possess the Holy Land, which is very based on dodgy arguments that you can't really argue with, because you can't argue with God. And the project of the Zionists is colonializing Palestine by getting rid and displace the Arab population. That is, in a nutshell, very, very briefly, what
Zionism believed it could solve the Jewish question by forming a separate Jewish state. I mean, that
but it's based, and as Moshe described, it is based on racism. It must apply racist measures to achieve this level of colonialization, etc. And in that sense, anti-Zionism is anti-racism, it's anti-imperialism, and this is why we oppose it. In order to fight racism, you need to be an anti-Zionist. Simple as that. Tony, you look like you want to say something quickly.
No, I just said, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. Yes, I mean, it's fundamental to Zionism.
Yeah,
Jews form a separate nation, which is an anti-Semitic concept, that Jews are not part of the nations amongst whom they live.
Okay.
But Zionism arose at a time when there was the so-called Jewish question. What was the place of Jews in European society? And its solution was, in essence, self-repatriation, to remove Jews from European society. And that fit in with what anti-Semitism did. So I agree with Moshe. But Zionism today is a movement of Jewish supremacy.
Yes, yes, indeed. So it goes beyond. It goes much beyond about having an Israeli state, which is what they want to tell us. We don't believe Jews should be thrown into the sea, but we also don't believe they have the right to oppress half the population on racist terms and more than that. So next steps, we would urge you to if you want to, join Labour Against the Witch Hunt. We have a members meeting on December the 12th. Chris will, of course, urge you, if he was here, he would urge you to join Resistance TV, Resistance Movement. You have a conference planned, and there will be news of that on December the 12th. We're hoping a conference on free speech on Israel-Palestine, which deals with the IRAM's definition of anti-Semitism, as well as the EHRA report, EHRC report, and questions of, as we discussed them today, how to fight back against the witch hunt. Thank you all for joining us this evening. There's been over 150 people in this meeting, with another 40 or 50 people watching online on our Facebook channel, and many more on Chris Williams.
It will be recorded. It's been recorded, hasn't it?
It's been recorded. We're putting this out tomorrow as a video as well. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. And we hope we've all learned something tonight. I certainly have. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.